Hello everyone, I am Michael Shaw. I'm a lecturer at the University of Stirling. And I suppose I've been invited to participate in this conversation because I'm currently beginning a project on 19th century queer Scottish literature and culture. And I also teach Edwin Morgan's poetry at the University of Stirling. So yeah, it's really fascinating for me to go back to Edwin Morgan's interview with Christopher Whyte, but then also to go back over Edwin Morgan's queer poems, so we can debate to what extent they are gay or queer poems, which we'll do today.
I'm Christopher Whyte. I'm talking in Budapest, but it's 31, 32 degrees at the moment, which is why it's so dark. We can't possibly raise the shutters. I taught in Edinburgh, then Glasgow from 1987 to 2005, and knew Edwin quite well at that time. The interview, that's maybe a good place to start, but my connection with Eddie begins with this book here, Poems of 30 Years. 1982, I was living in Rome, teaching at the university there, living in a gay relationship with an Italian man, so quite clear about who I was. And this book arrived in the post, 1983, and I read it, and I started thinking, what's going on here? There's something that doesn't quite fit. I knew nothing about Morgan's background or his life, just that he taught at Glasgow. So I actually took a piece of paper and made 3 headings: yes, no, and maybe. And yes, for me, was the poems that were definitely to another man. No were the ones that suggested that, no, this guy's heterosexual, and maybe were the ones in the middle. And that was as far as it went at that point, you know, these very ambivalent texts, but the suggestion. And for me, obviously, the question, is he actually gay? Which is not a question so much for literary scholars, but that was there at the time. And then I came back to Scotland in 1985. So 5 years after the law had changed, 5 years after it stopped being technically a crime, you know, and to my surprise, I got a job teaching at Edinburgh University. Cairns Craig was on sabbatical and I was standing in for him. I had his room and we had a first year paper in Scottish literature. And Eddie was the external for that paper. So I think it must have been 1987, summer 1987. We'd gone through the various procedures and the 2 senior members of the commission got up to go somewhere else, and I was left to look after the guest, you know. And he was quite a formidable person, no small talk, not easy to talk to, and also a personality. And I remember we were at opposite ends of quite a big room, and there was a silence, and I said, you know, Eddie, you love poetry. Silence. Some of it is quite courageous. And he said, yes. And I said, I thought maybe we could do an interview. And to my surprise, he said, yes, that would be fine. And my understanding of it, Michael, was that this was all very much undercover. So I would do a transcription, and then the tapes and the material would all go back to him into his archive, and maybe years after he died, it would emerge, but somewhere it would be written down. These are gay poems, and this man was gay, and it couldn't be denied. But rather to my surprise, well, there was a lot going on there. 1990 was his 70th birthday. And it was also, I understand, when an aging female relative died, an aunt, I think, you know, which meant that there were no family members to be shocked or displeasured by this. And it was also the occasion for various celebrations. Robert Crawford was editing a book of essays for Edinburgh University Press. So we'd done the interviews at that point in his flat in Whittingham Court. And I actually wrote to Robert and said, you know, how would it be if I did an essay on the love poetry? And Robert wrote back and said, well, actually, Ian Crichton-Smith is going to do that. And of course, Ian Crichton-Smith wrote a beautiful essay in which there's absolutely, he doesn't touch on the question of the addressees of the poems. And there was also a man for whom I have a great respect, who taught for many years in your department. I remember after we did the interview meeting in the Ubiquitous Chip in Glasgow for a drink, and I told him, and he actually said, does that mean it can be talked about?
Oh.
So the understanding was that we're allowed to know, but we mustn't say anything. And I think the best interpretation is that that was seen as protective of Eddie, you know, that you wouldn't want to break his alibi, as it were. And this person was asking if this meant that finally he could speak a little bit more openly.
Mm.
So,
So how did the interview come to be published then? Because that is the quite remarkable thing about it. You can imagine Morgan having these thoughts and wanting to talk about these things, but it's quite another thing for that to end up in print in 1990.
well, luckily there was another book, not such an academic book, being prepared by Polygon. Is that right? Huh? Nothing Not Giving Messages. It's Eddie's own title. And Peter Kravitz at Polygon was doing a lot at that time in publishing Scottish literature and making things possible. And I think he was brought up in London, but to some extent he was an outsider, cosmopolitan, who wasn't really aware of the issues there might be or the problems there might be. And he knew of this interview and he was very keen to have it for the book. And Eddie said to me this was happening. So I got down to work and that's how it came to be published. But I was very surprised. I mean, it came as a bit of a shock and I had to work quite hard to do the transcription. And in fact, what I did was to reorganize the things Eddie had said. I didn't change a word, that was very important, but I sort of compiled bits and pieces and put it together and then inserted my questions afterwards and showed the whole thing to him, of course, at which point it went to the press and was published.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's fascinating. And yeah, that's my feeling as well. I was surprised when I read it, because from reading Morgan's poetry, so often his gay poems, or his potentially gay poems, that they're coded in various ways. And I was shocked just at how open and candid he was in the interview. And when I was reading it, I was thinking, what was he like when actually discussing with them? You know, did you get a sense that he was relieved in telling you these things? Was there a catharsis? Because that's kind of what came through for me.
But I think when we did the interview, there was no certainty about publication.
Right,
and there was an element that we were two Scottish gay men from Glasgow talking to one another. Yeah. And that opened up a lot, I think, because there were underlying assumptions about what you couldn't normally talk about, but when you were in gay company, you could talk about. And I think that put him very much at his ease. When he was talking about things like, you know, when the school trip went to Germany in 1937 and they were all instructed to wear kilts with nothing underneath, I was quite taken aback at that, you know, at how absolutely open he was and direct and sensual about the whole thing. There was a lot of laughter, and I tried to put that into the interview. To some extent, the laughter was a slight embarrassment, but I think it was also what you're talking about, this tremendous relief of being able to talk. But don't you think, I think even in the 50s and 60s in Glasgow, I mean, I remember even in the 1990s in Edinburgh, people would say, is it going to be a mixed party? And that meant, will there be straight people there? Okay. Because there was an issue of territoriality. You know who you're talking to, you know who you can give the glad eye to. And in these circumstances, there's a tremendous relief of what is normally taken to be abnormal can be the norm. And I think there's something of that in that conversation, that it was done, that there was a great deal of ease about it, you know.
Yeah, no, I see that there was this familiarity between you, and that allowed him to express these things. But nevertheless, there's something for me where he's almost giving more information than you're asking for at times, you know. And you know, there's some details he goes into. Think about that wonderful sequence where he's talking about being in the army, and there's a boy or another man in the room who, you know, they're having some kind of relationship, and then they decide they're going to have sex that night under a mosquito net in the company of everybody else. And it goes into that in quite a lot of detail. And again, there's just a part of me that thought, is he seeing this as an opportunity to have that recorded and documented, something that he hasn't had on the record beforehand, perhaps?
I think he was very aware that everything connected with him was going to be in the public domain at some point. I once wrote to him, you know, Eddie, writing to you is like writing to the police, because everything you put down, you know, it's going to end up in an archive at some point. So I think he was very conscious of that. But there was a very, very tough side to Eddie, which is not always attractive. Very, very, I don't know if harsh is the word, but that's what allowed him to survive. And I mean, there are elements in the interview too about sex in public places in Glasgow and dangerous sex. I think that's just a side of him, that very gutsy physical side. And whereas in the poetry, it would be filtered by his literary consciousness, speaking, it would come out in a much more open way. Now, I think there were no holds barred in that sense. I think that's just part of his character, that very terra side. But it's very perceptive of you to see that. I think that's definitely something that is not so much in the poems. It would be wonderful if he had written memoirs, but he didn't write memoirs about that, you know. The memoirs about the things that could not be said and cannot normally be talked about.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that we're talking about how candid and open he is in this interview. And yet, what's the title of the interview? Again, I'll just need to look it up. It's Power in Things Not Disclosed. Is that right?
Things not said.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing that comes up in the interview, and you sort of push him a little bit on this, and because he does seem to kind of partly enjoy the idea of sort of things that aren't spoken, and this is key to his poetry, isn't it? It's, you know, all these things that lie just beneath the surface and sometimes sort of pierce through. But yeah, he goes into it and almost sort of suggests that there was something energizing, or there was an agency in repression in some way. And it's this tension that we get in that interview between his real candidness, but then it's put alongside this, well, maybe for want of a better word, a kind of fetishizing of repression. Did you feel that as well when doing the interview? Was he kind of wrestling between being open and also being more reserved?
Cairns Craig and I did, which was the first ever honours paper in Scottish literature at Glasgow, at Edinburgh University, sorry. That was 1988, 1989. And we divided up the sessions. And I had the one on Edwin Morgan. And I said, I'm going to talk about his love poetry. And I thought 20 minutes, that's not too much and not too little. And I wrote everything out. And when I got to that point in the lecture, my knees began to shake, you know, because I was just aware, well, it certainly felt like a very risky thing to do. And I remember taking hold of the lectern and looking very hard at my notes and just carrying on. And once I was back in flow, I lifted my head, and about a third of the class were staring out of the window the way they do. Another third were writing furiously, and 2 or 3 were looking at me with broad smiles on their faces. And clearly, I think they knew what was happening and what this meant to me. And one of the seminars was immediately after the class. And, you know, I made the coffee and passed it round. We were all sitting down. And one of the brighter members of the class, he was a fifer, said, but Edwin Morgan's a great Scottish poet. He can't be homosexual. And there was a silence and then an outburst of uproarious laughter. And I thought, he's done the job for me, you know. We can all go home now, because everything to be said about the canon, the exclusion and so on, by sharing his unease, he'd opened that up. So I was talking about censorship and coded text. And the fact that coming from a Western democracy, we think we never have to deal with censorship or coded texts. Whereas that's precisely what Morgan's poems at this time are. And I'm interested in what you say about fetishizing repression, because for me, going back to them now after a gap of 30 years is the intensity of the repression that I'm aware of. There's something very, very poignant about those poems, about the danger of speaking and just opening that little crack. He couldn't acknowledge the fact that the texts were censored. And he had to divide his audience so that the people in the know would pick up, as I did in faraway Rome, and the people who didn't know. I mean, they were teaching Glasgow Green, which is about a scene of homosexual rape. That was being taught in schools until 1990. The blindness. And I think that's an aspect of the repression, that when the repression was so severe, you could get away with a lot more. It's paradoxical, and I would never want to go back to that. But I think that's probably one aspect of Morgan's surprising, you know, horny openness, and the primness isn't the word, but the fear about speaking and not speaking. So that there's so much in those poems, you know, and so much that is uncomfortable. And and yet very, very beautiful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's sort of uncomfortable but beautiful is the way to put it. I'm reminded of The Unspoken, one of his earlier poems, which strikes me towards the end. It's playing with Lord Alfred Douglas's whole idea of the love that dare not speak its name. But the very final line, I've just got it here, is without a name to the end. And it's this sort of, there's almost like a declaration or a commitment and an energy that he's getting from that unspokenness, which, as you say, I find it really uncomfortable reading now. And yet, for Morgan,
you're quite being fair to him, because if what you were saying were absolutely true, there would be no poems, there would be a silence, and he's constantly risking, constantly. There's that poem of being on the top of a double-decker bus in Glasgow and a soldier from Aden sitting next to him, and to some extent, you need to put different poems in those volumes together, and some poems can open up others. For me, there's an element of the fifth column in here, because he does something very subtle. That if there's a poem that looks like a heterosexual poem, but could also be a gay poem, what that does is to contaminate a whole world of other poems which are perfectly innocent, which weren't written as double text, which can serve as double text. So it's an incredibly subversive and effective technique for entering into enemy territory. And then who's safe? Nobody may be safe at all. And that is a classic case of queering, something of opening up all sorts of possibilities where they weren't there before. So, you and I, there's 35 years between us, so we're from very different generations and very different experiences as gay men growing up in Scotland or in Europe. But looking back, I think the tremendous courage of the man comes over, and this toughness, the toughness that was there. I once talked to him about Pasolini, who's a film director, a poet in Italy, whom I adore in many ways, although I disapprove of him to some extent. And it's perfectly clear now that when Pasolini was murdered, it was not a gay pickup who lost his temper. It was politically ordered from the highest spheres in Italian society. It was a political murder. And I remember saying to Eddie, look at the two of you. Your story is a success story. And balancing what you say about the no name, there are these poems from later on, towards the end of Eddie's life, about cottaging. Anybody who doesn't know, that means having gay sex in a public toilet in Glasgow. And there's a very explicit poem about oral sex and ribbons of sperm on the mouth of his partner. Those are quite different kinds of poems from the coded text we're talking about. I do think there's a lot that needs to be celebrated in the particularly sexophobic, frightened of sex context of Scottish literature and Scottish culture. But maybe I'm unjust in saying that. I don't know what you think about it.
No, I absolutely agree. And yeah, just to qualify my earlier comments, I do see these as incredibly energizing poems, because they're poems of infiltration, right? And the way that he sort of allows poems to get into the canon, to get into teaching, but actually is creating spaces for queer identities to be expressed and for queer representation. The one that you mentioned earlier that I think is just incredible in this context is Glasgow Green, which is, one of his most widely known poems, one that he said that was taught in schools. And yet it seems to be one of his most explicit of the early poems from a gay perspective.
It does in the interview, doesn't it? That's a kind of amalgam of several different encounters, but because anything they do is criminal, he has no recourse to the law. Even if he'd wanted to go to the police afterward and say, I was forced to do this by this man, they're both beyond the law, both outside that territory. That's something else I was thinking about, that I think, speaking as an older person to a younger person, when I grew up in Glasgow, culturally, Glasgow was not part of Scotland or part of Scottish literature. I think until the 1970s, that's the case. It's scandalous. There's a good tradition of Glasgow novels, but Scottishness and Scottish literature was defined as being something else. Glasgow was another place, or contaminated or impure. And the common wisdom would be, if you want to become a writer or write, get out of Glasgow. And Morgan predated Hobsbawm and the Glasgow School. He was from an earlier generation, and he broke the rules, if you like. And because he was writing about Glasgow, he was writing from a kind of extraterritoriality. He was outside. And also, as a gay man writing, he had a different kind of extraterritoriality, outside what could be spoken, what could be said. And my idea would be that with Morgan, these two extraterritorialities worked together in a very positive way. He was able to exploit one in order to make the other possible. So the two things, and there's a very strong connection between Glasgow and his love poetry, also in an anthropological sense. I mean, there's so much that we can only guess at, but there's quite a lot in the interview about having sex with married men and how comfortable working class Glasgow married men were about having a bisexual existence. And he even quotes this saying that Glasgow is the bisexual capital of Europe. Now, it's just possible that he's referring to something which is characteristic of this industrial, very, very poverty-stricken city in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and which would not be talked about and would not get into written records. My suspicion would be because of the immigration and the kind of amnesia that Glasgow induced in people. They arrived there, and it didn't matter where they came from. I think there was a huge freedom, actually, in sexual terms. For women, I don't know. Interesting to look at that. That's even more unspoken, isn't it? But for men who were the heads of a household, I think there probably was a degree of freedom that would surprise us, you know. And of course, because of the gay thing being outside the law, class boundaries dissolve, don't they? You know, I mean, his partner, John Scott, was from a different religion and a different class. And that, I think, is one of the strange benefits of being homosexual in that repressive, silent situation. You know, that it creates such a strong bond that other barriers tend to dissolve and drop, you know. I don't know if that's the case with people of your age. I suspect it's less the case now. I could be wrong, you know.
Yeah, no, I think it is less the case. And it's what I enjoyed from the interview was the kind of historical side of it, and the way that Morgan outlines this subculture in Glasgow of, you know, where people were meeting, the pubs they were going to, the book groups that he was part of, and how books were sent up from London, then they'd meet in groups together to discuss it. It's actually a really important part of queer history that is being documented.
The word that comes to my mind, there's a shamelessness about it. The wonderful thing about the interview is he's not ashamed.
Yeah.
He just isn't, and that's part of the toughness too. I think the most terrifying thing about the repression is not being spoken about. You know, and I think that's, I don't know, but that's one of the issues with lesbian sex that is even more, you know, under a taboo of silence. But even if you're referred to in negative terms, at least it's an acknowledgement that you exist. And to have nothing at all, that's the most painful situation, predicament to be in, I think.
You know, this is a point that's often made of 19th century Scotland, where you had the wild trials, etc., in London, and various scandals, which at least created an identity and created a discourse that could be debated, whereas several critics like Geoffrey Meek made the point that in Scottish periodical newspapers, you just don't get any discussion in the same way. And yeah, that creates, I suppose it creates more of a silence that might allow you to sort of, you're less likely to be persecuted, but at the same time, it means that you don't have sort of any claim to an identity or a culture.
What kind of perspective is the researches you're doing about the 19th century giving you on Morgan's poetry? I mean, is it really a first? Is there really nothing preceding, no traces beforehand?
I mean, there's certainly traces that you see throughout, but the thing we can find in a lot of 19th century texts is there's homosexuality comes in the sense of homosexual panic. There's a worry about it, even with some queer writers. So, and I think it's different when we get to Morgan. It's a form of repression, but it's a repression where he's trying to create a space for inclusion, I suppose, in some way, and trying to provide some representation.
He was very conscious of the need to find some sort of a tradition behind. There's an essay called A Scottish Trawl, published in Gendering the Nation, where he talks about Robert Ferguson and various other people doing his very best to create a background. I think it's a good thing to try. I don't know how much you can actually do, but it's certainly worth trying.
He certainly does that with other writers like Shakespeare, for instance, that he'll go into sort of, well, we get that with instructions to an actor with The Winter's Tale, but then also in the interview when he talks about the sonnets as well, and that sense of creating that tradition that's there, and also with Iago, just referenced as well.
I think it's very hard to talk about specific sexual cultures. And this is, I think, Scottish culture and Scottish identity are quite distinct from Southern English culture and identity, and from Irish. I think ideas of masculine and feminine, understandings of what's masculine and feminine change, and that also affects attitudes to changing the gender of your sexual partner. I think it would be interesting if much more of that could be brought into the light of day, but I see it as very hard at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this thing with the unspoken nature of it. It's very hard to find the resources to do this kind of work effectively, but there are resources there. So it's just finding them. Even
today in dealing with Morgan, this is out in the open, if you like, but it's not something that people particularly want to emphasize. I had a very disturbing experience the last time I taught this poetry in Glasgow with a group of students. It didn't go well at all. They said, does it matter? Why is it important that he's writing to a man? You know, and I was disarmed at that point. I didn't know what to say at all. I just thought, oh, I'm out of my depth here. What's happened? My audience has changed. Have you had that experience, Michael?
I've not had that experience, but it strikes me that's part of a kind of acceptance culture. So often now, you know, when people come out, the sort of people think the acceptable and the sort of the nice reaction to give is to say, well, it doesn't matter. So I imagine that's probably what's behind that, is it's their way of saying, oh, it doesn't matter that he's gay, when of course it does matter that he's gay, and that's a huge and important context behind what he's trying to do with these poems. But yeah, I think there's probably people trying to appear that they're accepting when actually they're dismissing.
I think about the sheer weight of damage done by suppression and silence in Scotland. And the attitude tends to be, the law has changed now, so everything's okay. But I think there's something that will go on for generations about the weight of damage done, as I said, and that needs to be addressed. And I'm an idealist. There needs to be some kind of an apology. God knows when that's going to come, but there needs to be an apology for what happened and what was done. I probably won't see it, but I think that would be appropriate. Michael, you wanted to say some things about Glasgow Green.
Yeah, sure. So this is the poem that Morgan says is one that he intended to be his queer liberation poem. Am I right in saying that's in the interview? He sort of thinks, is this my queer liberation poem? And then he kind of thinks, well, actually, I'm not sure it was entirely successful as a queer liberation poem. So yeah, I thought it'd just be interesting for us to sort of debate that and to think through to what extent it works as a queer lib poem. I mean, I can kick off. I think in some ways it is, or it becomes a queer liberation poem as we get closer to the end. One thing I'm struck by is all the different forms of fecundity, of fertility, of reproduction that he associates with same-sex desire, which I imagine at that time was really quite a radical thing to do in a way, when so much focus is on what's now called heterofuturity, of, you know, heterosexuals as reproducing, and that's their contribution to the world, and the homosexuals are undermining that, whereas Morgan's really subverting that narrative. And I'm struck by some lines that are really quite controversial, you know, but the beds of married love are islands in a sea of desire. You know, that sense of almost
there's a terrible phrase they use in Spanish, which is follas menos que un casado. You get even less sex than somebody who's married. This is in Spanish. And the thing there, you know, the beds of married love are islands in a sea of desire. The desire is in the sea. There's no desire on the islands. It's very, very provocative. I don't think that, I wouldn't think that was intentional. I think that just comes out, but it's very, very disturbing. Desire is somewhere else. What strikes me in this poem now is do you think I came here just for that? Is crossing the class boundary, and that because Morgan is going across this into a very violent Glasgow world, his physical safety is in question, with a sexual partner. And that's another of the, cut the scene here, there's no crying for help. It must be acted out again. It's a wonderfully honest poem. It doesn't attempt to beautify it in any way. And yet, as you say, there's this incredible erotic fruitfulness in it.
So one of the things I find a bit frustrating about this poem is the association of gay sex in Glasgow Green with criminality and with rape. And I tried to think through, could he have written this poem in a way that focuses on a consensual, violent sex? Because I think the violence is quite important to this poem. But I just wonder, why did it have to be portrayed as a criminal act? And did he have to do it because of the fact that this is one of his more explicit poems, so he has to kind of refer out to that legal context to make it more acceptable? Or is it a part of his own sort of repression and his lack or his unwillingness to fully be explicit with it?
I think you're a bit unfair. I think they're beyond the law anyway. Whatever they do, even if they kiss, it's a crime. Yeah. And whether they kiss or one of them rapes the other, they're beyond the law in any case. And he's opening up that space. And then when it says, "What do you mean, see me again?" it's clear that the speaker is looking for something a bit more tender, some stronger connection. And it's not in the poem, but Morgan says in the interview that at the end of one of these encounters, the man changed and said, do you know how to get back to where you're going? And became quite protective. And I think there are all sorts of levels. Yes.
Yeah, you're right. There is a sort of a sense of something more consensual, perhaps, coming on there, a desire for some form of relationship.
I think it's that he doesn't attempt to beautify this, that maybe the need for some sort of sexual realization is so powerful that even if it's this, it's better than nothing, it's better than silence. And I don't know, that's something I can appreciate.
Do you find it surprising that this was taught in schools?
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. But I think that brings us back to the weight of not seeing and not understanding, which can be very hard for us to open up to. And I think it's also connected to something else Morgan talks about, which is the number of gay men in Glasgow who will be married and with families. And that's a reality that should be honoured and looked at openly. And I think it's very, very disturbing for a lot of people. Either for very, very hardline queers who say this shouldn't be happening, it should be one thing or the other, or for other people to say this is, gay men can make excellent husbands and very caring fathers. And that was certainly, for men of Morgan's generation, that was in many ways the best solution. I left Scotland when I was 18 and Britain when I was 21 because of that, because I wanted to live in a place where I was not going to be in danger and there wouldn't be that degree of repression. But if I'd stayed, that would have been an obvious solution for someone in my position, who didn't really have a problem with women. And I think all of these aspects are there.
Yeah, no, part of me wonders, how would you teach this without sort of invoking the queer context? I mean, it's just so obvious. And one of the things I appreciate about what Morgan's doing is he's providing a history of Glasgow's landscapes as well through a queer perspective. And, if you know anything about kind of Glasgow's queer history, you know how important Glasgow Green is as a site of, dogging, I suppose, of sort of outdoor sex, and why that was important, why it had to be outdoors, especially for a lot of people in the working class, because how did they find private spaces in order to do that? So yeah, it sort of highlights maybe the amnesia around that queer history in Glasgow, that these things aren't better known. And if you don't know that basic context, how can you engage with the poem properly?
For me, it brings us back to the silence generally about sexuality in Scottish culture. I'm not living in Scotland any longer, but it strikes me a culture with a particularly strong history of sexophobia, of fear of sex. And I think a great many of these things need to be opened out and looked at in a very uncomfortable way in Scotland and owned up to. And I think that would be a good way of honouring Edwin Morgan's contribution too, in opening up these questions in a way that's not always comfortable.
And it's so important, I think, for Scottish literature as a discipline as well, because so much of the tradition is in Bawdry, in, if you think about back to Robert Burns and his sort of more pornographic poems and how they emerged out of that ballad tradition. And it's striking how little that side of Burns is known popularly. That he wrote a poem called Nine Inch. So what's it? Sorry. 9 Inch Will Please a Lady. He
has a poem called My Wandering Willie, hasn't it?
Yeah. It's this sort of, it's this thing that I think you're right, there is still a kind of sexophobia that is being addressed. I think of Polly Mackay's work at Glasgow has been looking at Burns's poems, and even there was that documentary on Burns that was produced earlier on in the year that was where Alan Bissett hosted, and they talked about these aspects, but it was sort of introducing it. You think, he's been the bard for 180 years. Why do these aspects of Burns need to be introduced just now? So hopefully,
I was teaching McDermott, teaching The Drunk Man, for example, out of mischievousness, I would sometimes suggest, shall we translate this into English? It's queer the thoughts a kittled cull can rouse or splurge and glit a null. And if you put that into English in the room, it became absolutely deeply embarrassing. Everybody was very uncomfortable. So there was an issue about, moving between those languages and what can be said in Scots. Morgan is a poet writing primarily in English, and I think English written into the language is the degree of problems with talking about sex. That's just part of the language that we inherit, if we choose to use English. It's said, my own poetry is in Gaelic, it's said that Gaelic had an extremely rich vocabulary for describing forms of sexual activity and sexual arousal. There's no way of checking this. Has it disappeared? Will there still be people alive who know it? How would you access it? Another of these questions hanging in the air beyond the silence, which is so difficult to break.
So what was the result of this poem publication? Because, as you said, even today reading it, it struck me as really quite a radical statement that Morgan was making, or a series of statements. Do you have a sense of what its kind of impact was in receiving Morgan and thinking about sexuality from the post-war period onwards?
You can't box in the love poetry or the gay poetry with Eddie, because it's elements flow into one another. And The Second Life, which for me is a very programmatic poem, it ends up slip out of darkness it is time. And to some extent, you could read that as being, it's time to talk openly about the kind of love I engage in. But it embraces so many, it's time to speak about Glasgow. It's time for Glasgow to emerge onto the literary scene. And he says in the interview that turning 40, that was around the time he met John Scott and finally had a connection that was sexual and powerfully emotional and ongoing. He started writing lots of poetry. So, as I say, we shouldn't box off too much the love poetry. It's connected to, and I would argue that his fluidity of identity was very important in creating possibilities. It's so ambivalent, isn't it? You see him as somebody who was very much penalized for being gay and was subjected to suppression, but also he was able to open up the treasure in that and all the possibilities. And in the end, it was a trump card. I think he turned it into a trump card. However much he may have, there's no greater blessing for a writer than having something new to say, something new to talk about. And to some extent, that was his great good fortune, even though he found it difficult to unpack it and open it up. It chills me to think about the double life he led. I mean, can you imagine being in the staff club in Glasgow in the 1960s? You know, lots of people in their tweed jackets and talking, and then having encounters like the one at the canal in Glasgow Green, and balancing these two sides, even having a what would be considered a more acceptable relationship with John Scott. But he wasn't somebody Eddie could present to his friends or go for a drink anywhere close to Glasgow University. And Glasgow's a very small place. When I taught in Glasgow, I lived in Edinburgh, because if I'd been living off Pars Road, my students would have been observing me all the time. You couldn't get away with anything, you know. So to think of the self-policing that he must have engaged in for years and years, and that becomes second nature, I think, later on. It's something that becomes it's ingrown, and it's part of your way of handling things. I still catch myself sometimes avoiding referring to it, because I think I'm going to upset the people I'm talking to. And that comes from me growing up in the 20s and 30s and the 70s, when you still had to be very careful, and you would be very careful. And always the sense that if I'm too open, it's going to disturb people, or I might lose friends. So there's that background.
Yeah, one of the things that I take from this poem and appreciate about it is how it evokes that queer experience of fantasy, I suppose, of in a culture of silence where you can't always act on particular encounters that might be. There's often this sense of something that might have been, something that's past, something that might turn into something later, who knows? And then we get him sort of towards the end of this poem, almost sort of romanticizing that fantasy, or that sense of what could become. Brush me with your wing, I'm lying here in my shadows, the ones for that night's sake. And it really taps into an important experience of desire in a culture of silence, I think.
For me, there's also something very feminine in the ending to that poem. You have to put it between inverted commas, but it's just there waiting for you to make a move, waiting for you to approach, if possible, in this very tender way.
Yeah. Sort of, but nevertheless soliciting it at the same time, right at the end. Brushing he's, or the speaker at least, is the agent, but hoping the other person is going to have the agency in that scenario. Also, the questioning as well is fascinating in this poem. Just that we go through, series of different questions that he's asking, and again, it's probing into a really important part of the gay experience. But again, incredibly coded, right? It's not explicitly about a man and another man. There are little suggestions that allow you to read it that way should you wish, but it's not made explicit at all. I mean, I suppose what I'm struck with when I teach Edwin Morgan is the focus is on the genderlessness of the poems, and there's a sense of is this his coded way of getting that across to a reader, and that there's an availability there. I suppose putting that further into context doesn't quite happen in the way that I would like to see. So,
I would want to dispute with you about genderlessness, if that's the word you use, because it's just a different kind of gender, or gender that's structured in a different way. It's not. There's no absence of eroticism or absence of the physical. They're very much there, just not within these very restricted terms that we're taught to understand it. I mean, Morgan's love poetry is very erotic. If you think of One Cigarette, very, very strongly erotic. I think erotic in a different way from how a straight man would write about his feelings for a straight woman. I'm not quite sure why there is. Probably straight men writing as straight men are subjected to all sorts of restrictions that we don't understand because we're not aware of them, I'm going off the subject a bit. May I, just for 2 minutes? I remember arguing about Tchaikovsky with some people in Edinburgh, at a dinner table. And how can you tell from Tchaikovsky's music that he was gay? And my theory is that music implies body movements. Music implies gestures. And one of the things about socializing as a straight man is learning to hold your body in a particular way and not to make certain movements. You know, one of the very obvious ones, don't bend over to tie your shoelaces, but there are all sorts of things about how you carry a shopping bag and so on. And I think that when you listen to Tchaikovsky's music, there's a bodily gesture, there's a way of moving the body implication that is not within that narrow box of straight male socialized movement, you know. And to some extent that must be there in Edwin Morgan's poetry too, that the fact that he is so fluid and undefined opens up all sorts of possibilities that aren't there. And it's not something essential. I think if you socialize and define as a straight man, there are huge payoffs in terms of solidarity and there can all sorts of things that you get, and that's one of the reasons people do it. But if you're not able to do that, there are payoffs too. There are payoffs too.